The morning started as usual. Bright sunlight streamed through the bedroom curtains, and I woke up to the smell of freshly brewed coffee, which Brian always made first thing in the morning. He stood by the kitchen island, immersed in a project, and looked at me tenderly when I walked in. "Will you have time to grab a sip of coffee before you head to your meeting?" he asked, handing me a cup. "Of course," I smiled. "You always know what I need." Recently, we had finished the project of our very own country house. It wasn't just a house, it was the result of our joint efforts. The weekend ahead was planned with friends, but today I had a meeting with a client for a new project. "Are you going to that event today?" Brian asked, pouring himself a second cup of coffee. "I remember you talking about it all week." "Yes, there will be many interesting speakers. By the way, I'll need to consult with you about the layout for a new office of an architect. The theme of his projects is exactly your style." "Sounds intriguing. Tell me all about it when you get back." He winked, gathering his things. I put on a light dress and hurried to the forum, feeling a soft breeze playing with my hair as I left the house. Art forums were always a special event in my world of design. The most creative people gathered here. Ideas floated in the air, and every conversation was full of meaning. The forum was exactly as I imagined. Presentations, people, art, everything whirled around me. In one of the halls, I accidentally ran into Nick, a photographer who had just returned from Paris. We struck up a conversation, and it turned out that he had been following my work for quite some time. "You created a stunning interior for the Museum of Contemporary Art," he began. "You have an incredible sense of space." "Thank you, that was one of my favorite projects," I replied, pleasantly surprised by his compliment. "By the way, I have a proposal if you're interested. I'm currently looking for a designer for a joint photo session of architectural interiors. I think your work would be perfect for it. How about we collaborate?" The offer was unexpected but tempting. Nick had charisma, impeccable style, and a perspective that always stood out. We agreed to meet in a few days to discuss the details. 2 days flew by, and soon I was already standing in front of the art studio. "Ashley, hi." Nick's voice rang out, and I turned to him. He was in a simple black t-shirt and jeans, but he looked as if he had just stepped off a fashion runway. His confidence was felt in every movement. "I'm glad you came. Come in. I've got everything ready." We sat down at the table, and Nick laid out some prints of his work in front of me. The photos were stunning. His take on architecture was sharp, but at the same time, he managed to convey the softness and atmosphere of the place. "Look at this," he began, showing me a few shots. "This is a series of photos of abandoned buildings in New York. I think we can create something similar, but with elements of your interiors. I've been wanting to do something new, something refreshing for a while now." "It's incredible," I replied, studying the photographs. "But I think we could add a bit more contrast, make the lighting and shadows more pronounced. It'll give it more depth." "Completely agree. That's exactly what I wanted to discuss with you. You have an amazing instinct. What do you say? Let's start with one building on the outskirts. I know the perfect spot for our first shoot." "And how are things going with your other projects?" he asked, shifting the conversation to me. "You're always coming up with new ideas. Does Brian support your endeavors?" I smiled, thinking of Brian. We really were a great team, and he always encouraged my professional ambitions. "Yes, everything's great. Brian is my main partner in everything I do," I replied, but suddenly felt a slight hint of doubt that surfaced somewhere deep inside. "That's wonderful." Nick nodded. "Support is important. You know, not everyone can be on the same wavelength as their partner when it comes to such creative and intense professions." The conversation continued in the same vein, and by the end of the evening, I realized that Nick and I weren't just talking about work, but about life in general. "So, shall we start our project this weekend?" he asked with a slight smile as we said our goodbyes. "Of course we're all set," I replied, but inside I felt a subtle flutter of excitement. When I stepped out onto the street, the evening city was bathed in warm light. I walked home, reflecting on how quickly and unexpectedly Nick had entered my life. The morning of the weekend started with pleasant bustle. I was getting ready for our first shoot with Nick, and although I had always been dedicated to my work, something was different this time. It wasn't the usual excitement before a project. Rather, it was a feeling that something unusual was ahead. Brian watched me with interest as we drank coffee in the kitchen. "So, what's the plan today?" he asked, lazily flipping through the morning paper. "What's the shoot about?" "Nick and I are going to an old abandoned theater on the outskirts of the city. It's perfect for our project. I can already imagine how its interiors will come alive in the photographs." I tried to speak as I usually did, but something in my voice changed when I mentioned Nick. Brian didn't notice. "That sounds exciting. Don't forget to take a few photos for me. I'd love to see the theater. We've been talking about doing a photo shoot in abandoned places for a while now." He smiled and went back to his paper. When I arrived at the location, Nick was already waiting for me with his camera in hand. "This place is incredible," I said quietly as I surveyed the space. "It feels like time has frozen here." "Exactly," Nick replied, turning on his camera. "That's why I chose it. It's like it's been waiting to be rediscovered." We got to work and everything went as usual. Nick took the photos and I helped adjust the lighting and suggested ideas for the composition. But at some point, when I was standing near a huge mirror covered in cobwebs, I felt his gaze. He wasn't looking at the subject he was supposed to be focusing on. He was looking at me. "You fit perfectly in this place," he said, lowering the camera. His voice was soft but expressive enough to make me freeze. "What do you mean?" I tried to keep the conversation light, but something inside me stirred at that moment. "I don't know how to explain it. I just feel like you and this space are one. You inspire me in a way no one has in a long time." He stepped closer, his eyes lingering on mine. "Maybe we're not just photographing an interior?" Our eyes met, and for a moment the world seemed to stop. It was one of those moments when everything familiar suddenly vanishes, leaving room for something new, frightening, and unknown. "Nick, let's get back to the shoot," I replied, trying to steer the conversation back to work. I turned away, feeling a strange sensation rising inside me, that this wasn't just a photo shoot, but the beginning of something bigger. He didn't respond, simply raised the camera again, but the tension between us was palpable. The work continued, but every glance, every movement felt different. When the shoot was over, we stepped outside. The wind had picked up, rustling the dry leaves from the trees, and I was about to say goodbye when Nick suddenly touched my shoulder. "Ashley." His voice was once again soft, but serious. "Have you ever thought that life can change all of a sudden, even when everything seems perfect?" I stopped, not knowing how to answer. He stood next to me, his gaze as tense as before. "Sometimes changes happen unexpectedly. We're not always ready to accept them, but they're inevitable," he said, and without waiting for a response, walked away. I stood alone on the empty street. The next morning, I tried to return to my usual life. Brian, as always, was busy with his projects, but this time I felt his attention on me more than before. Brian noticed my distracted state as we sat drinking coffee in the morning. "Is everything okay? You seem a bit distant," he said, pulling his gaze away from his laptop. "After the shoot, you seemed so inspired, but today you look kind of lost." "Everything's fine, just a little tired," I replied, trying to avoid meeting his eyes. "That shoot was more intense than I expected." He nodded, but I could tell he wasn't fully convinced by my words. Inside, a wave of guilt surged. Everything was great. We were an amazing team, but now I felt like something had gone wrong. Nick had found his way into my thoughts, and I couldn't understand how it had happened so quickly. A few days later, Nick invited me to another shoot. This time, the location was different. An old factory, abandoned since the 80s. When I arrived at the factory, Nick was already waiting for me by the main entrance. The dusk was setting in, creating an atmosphere of mystery. "You chose the perfect time for the light," I said as I looked around the space. Inside, it was cold, but the rays of the setting sun were streaming through the broken windows. painting the walls in warm orange hues. "Yeah, this place has been calling me for a while," Nick replied, pulling out his camera. "It's like you, full of hidden stories." I stopped at his words, feeling the tension begin to rise again. It seemed like every gesture, every word he spoke held a hidden meaning. I tried to focus on the work, but Nick was standing too close. We were discussing the composition for a photo when he suddenly leaned in towards me, almost close enough to touch my face. "Ashley." His voice was soft but insistent. "I think you know what's happening between us." I froze, unsure of how to respond. We were standing so close that I could feel the warmth of his breath. My heart raced. "Nick, this is wrong," I whispered, stepping back. "Wrong? Or just unexpected?" He didn't back off. His eyes burned with a strange intensity. "You know there's more between us than just work. I felt it from the beginning." I turned away, trying to keep control of my emotions. "You're mistaken," I said, though deep down I knew he was right. This wasn't just professional collaboration. We continued with the shoot, but the tension between us was too palpable. I felt his gaze linger on me longer than necessary. Every conversation was filled with hints, and I couldn't ignore it any longer. When we finished, I quickly packed up my things and headed for the exit. Nick tried to say something, but I didn't give him the chance. "I need to go," I said, leaving before he could continue the conversation. Sitting in the car, I stayed behind the wheel for a long time without turning on the engine. The next day, Nick called me again. His voice was unusually quiet. "Ashley, I need to talk to you. This isn't just about the project," he said. "Can we meet today?" My first instinct was to refuse. I knew that meeting with him could complicate everything, but something inside me pulled me toward him. I agreed. We met at a small cafe in the city center. Time seemed to slow down when I saw him sitting by the window. I sat across from him, feeling the tension grow with each passing second. "I don't know how to start this conversation," he began, brushing his hair back from his face. "From the moment we started working together, I haven't been able to stop thinking about you. I know this could ruin everything you have, but I can't hide it anymore. I know you're happy with Brian," he continued, avoiding my gaze. "And I don't want to hurt you. But I can't keep pretending that I don't care." His words cut through me like a knife. I felt the tears welling up, but I forced myself to hold them back. I needed to be strong, to tell him that he was wrong, that this was just a moment of weakness. But deep inside, I knew that wasn't true. "Nick, you don't understand," I finally said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I can't destroy my life for something that might turn out to be a mistake." He sighed and looked at me with pain in his eyes. "And what if it's not a mistake? What if it's what you've been searching for all along?" Those words hung in the air, heavy as a stone. I wanted to respond, but I couldn't. Inside, a battle was raging, one that seemed impossible to resolve. I loved Brian. We had been partners in life, but Nick had awakened something in me that had long been dormant. "I need time," I said, standing up from the table. "I can't give you an answer right now." One evening, while Brian and I were watching a movie, he suddenly turned off the TV and turned to me. "Ashley, I can't stay silent any longer. I can see that something is going on. You've changed." His voice was full of pain, though he tried to remain calm. "I know work can be stressful, but this feels like something else. You know you can tell me anything, right?" "Brian," I began, feeling the words catch in my throat. "I never wanted this to happen. You've always been everything to me. But I'm confused." His eyes narrowed, and I saw the pain flash across his face. He stayed silent, giving me space to continue. "I met Nick at that art forum, and we started working together on a project," I continued, feeling the tension build with every word. "And over time, something changed. I started to have feelings for him, feelings I didn't expect. It's hard to explain. It's wrong, I know." Brian was silent for a long time, staring at one spot as if he was processing my words. I felt the growing distance between us, but his calmness unsettled me more than anything. You fell in love with him? He finally asked, his gaze never leaving me. So, it's not just nothing? He spoke slowly, holding back his emotions. We've spent so many years together, Ashley. And now you're telling me that none of that means anything? I couldn't hold back the tears anymore. No, that's not true, Brian. You've always meant so much to me, but right now I don't understand what's happening. These feelings hit me out of nowhere. I never wanted this, but it's real. I don't know what to do. He stood up from the couch and walked over to the window. His shoulders were tense, and he was clearly trying to hold himself together. If you think you'll be happier with him, he began, his voice shaking. I can't hold you back. I love you, Ashley, and I always will. But if you can't be with me anymore, I have to accept that. Those words broke me completely. I could see how hard it was for him to say that, how much he was struggling with his own emotions to give me the freedom I needed. Brian had never been aggressive or harsh. His kindness had always moved me, and now it only deepened my guilt. I couldn't respond. I stood up from the couch and, unable to bear the moment any longer, I walked to the bedroom and closed the door behind me. When I returned home that night, the house was enveloped in silence. Brian was sitting in the living room, and the soft light fell across his face, casting shadows that made him look even more tired and drained than before. He turned toward me, his eyes filled with sorrow and expectation. You were with him? He asked quietly, without getting up from the couch. I nodded, unable to say a word. Inside, everything was falling apart, and the weight of guilt wouldn't let go. I knew this moment would be a turning point. And now what? He continued, looking at me with a long, piercing gaze. Have you made your choice? Those words hit me like a blow. I realized that everything truly depended on me now. I had to make the final decision, one that would change not only my life, but the lives of two people I loved. The time for hesitation was over. I can't lie anymore, I began, trying to steady the tremor in my voice. Brian, you've always been the one I could rely on. We've shared the best years together. But something has changed. I didn't want this. I didn't seek this. But Nick, he awakened something in me that I thought had long been gone. I paused, trying to gather my thoughts. Every word felt like a knife cutting through both of us. I love you, but I can't be the person I once was anymore. I can't keep living, pretending everything is the same. I need to leave. A heavy silence filled the room. I saw Brian clench his fists, his face contorted with pain. But he didn't yell. He didn't argue. He didn't accuse. He just sat there, quietly processing my words. I always knew you were different, he finally said, his voice hoarse as if every word took immense effort. I always admired your strength, your independence. But I never thought it would drive you away from me. I never wanted to keep you in a cage. If you think you'll be happier with him, I won't stop you. Those words tore me apart. I could see how much he was suffering, yet he stayed true to himself. Honest, kind, and understanding. That was what had made him so important to me all these years. But I realized now that my path was no longer beside his. I couldn't find the words to express both my gratitude and my pain at the same time. All I could manage was to quietly say, I'm sorry. I met Nick in the park where we had once discussed our first project. When he saw me with the suitcase, his face lit up with a gentle smile. Are you sure? He asked, stepping closer and taking my hand. I nodded, feeling a strange sense of calm settle within me. Yes, I replied, though I knew the path I had chosen would be full of challenges. It was my choice.